after talking about Thomas and last week, I can't help but feel like that was a tailor-made encounter for Thomas that Jesus offered up when he appeared to them. And it made me realize over reflecting on that how deeply personal our encounters with Jesus, even now, can be, and how they're tailor-made specifically. I mean, with each of us, I feel like he offers unique direction and individualized comfort and specialized personal love designed specific for your personality and your purpose in mind, for your specific needs. So, with that in mind, I pray that our conversation regarding a personal dialogue today between Jesus and Peter will also offer some transferable sights into your current faith and journey of how Jesus is having these very personalized conversations. And I'm hoping that we can extend that into our own personal walk with him as well, because that's what he offers to each of us as well. So with that in mind, let's dive in. Today, we'll talk about Peter from John chapter 21. But to start off, we know from Matthew 28 that this is about 2 to 3 weeks after the resurrection. And Jesus, around this time, had told his disciples to go ahead of him to a mountain in Galilee, and wait for him there. And according to John 21, here's what happens then after that. So I'm going to kick it off with verse 2. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, which is James and John, and 2 other of his disciples were together. So 7 disciples had decided to eagerly go right away after Jesus had told them, go and I'll meet you there. We don't know where the other 4 are. Maybe they just haven't arrived yet. But these 7 have been waiting for a couple of days for Jesus to show up as he promised. And Peter gets antsy. So verse 3, Simon Peter said to them, remember, after waiting for a couple of days, I'm going fishing. Like, I can't do this anymore. I'm going fishing. So if Thomas was doubting Thomas, if Peter had a nickname, it would be Impulsive. After a lot of his encounters, we know he's quick to act. Sometimes he's jumping ahead and often speaking before he thinks. Because of that, the fact that Peter says he's going fishing is often interpreted as disobedient. Just like Thomas' one encounter, right? There are scholars that say, well, he should have waited on the mountain just like God told him to. Just like Jesus said. I said, go to the mountain. He's not in the mountain. He's in the sea fishing, right? However, I do love how other scholars commend Peter's action for a lesson that we can all learn in his waiting. Insight number 1, when waiting on Jesus, you can wait passively or actively. So you could do nothing in the process. In other words, Peter was waiting, but he wasn't going to just sit idly by twiddling his thumbs. I mean, they needed to eat, so there's something productive he could be doing. So Peter did what he knew to do while he's in this process of waiting on Jesus to show up. He fished. You probably heard the illustration that you can't steer a parked car, right? In order to direct a car, it needs to be moving, right? And this is the concept of an active waiting versus a passive waiting. And you have to remember, the disciples are still in a very confused state and uncertain season. Jesus has shown back up alive. They still don't know what that means for them. They still don't know what their future holds. And they could have sat staring at each other on this mountain, questioning and complaining. But instead, Peter says, I'm going to do something. And as we will soon see, Jesus meets him where he was at the moment. But likewise, our lives often have seasons of waiting, where we're waiting to hear Jesus speak. We're waiting to see Jesus move in a situation. We're waiting to feel his touch in a time of turmoil or crisis. But waiting isn't an excuse to do nothing. And that's insight 2. Actively serving, actively loving, actively seeking, and actively engaging in what we have already learned should never take a back seat in a season of waiting. Peter gets that. Peter is demonstrating that for us. And according to the next verse, it's very clear that Peter is quite the natural leader among the disciples. He's respected by them because they immediately say, when Peter says, I'm going fishing, the other 6 disciples say, well, we're going with you also. Pretty impressive that somebody we know as a denier, right? They're actually still respectful of him. So as it says, we're going with you also. They went out and immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. So fishing at night was the best time to fish on the Sea of Galilee. So they lit their torches, which would help attract the fish to the boat. And then they cast their nets, and despite doing everything right, they caught nothing. And the entire night passes, no bites, no fish, nothing in the net. And then the sun starts to rise. Verse 4. But when the morning had come, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. I don't know, maybe the boat was too far, they couldn't see him. Maybe the light wasn't strong enough, it was too dim. Or maybe Jesus wanted it that way. We don't know. But here's Jesus shows up on the shore. Verse 5. Then Jesus said to them, children, have you any food? And they answered him, no. Verse 6. And he said to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, then you'll find some. So they cast, and now they were not able to draw the net in because of the multitude of fish. So first of all, he wasn't being derogatory by calling them children, but by Greek standards, this was an endearing word, an endearing term of endearment for them. He was referring to them as his own. And second, remember, anytime that Jesus asks a question, it's a rhetorical question, right? So Jesus knew all things, knew that they had no fish, but once again, Jesus wanted them to consider their situation and confess it, admit it, be aware of it out loud. So he's bringing them to an awareness of the reality that based on their human limitations, doing everything they knew to do, they still caught nothing. But when Jesus shows up and tells them to do something different, it makes all the difference. So they went from nothing to this overwhelming success of fish in the net. The weight of the sudden onset of the fish was more than they could physically even draw into the boat. But notice, this is so interesting to me, that for Jesus to tell them to take the net from the left side of the boat and then cast it onto the right side of the boat is only the difference of about 7.5 feet, right? The width of the boat. That's it. And I love how one scholar wrote this about that. He said, there was no logical reason why fishing on one side of the boat would be better than the other side. It wasn't even directly a test of trust in Jesus, because it says they didn't know it was him until the fish were caught. Now, this was probably a test of their ability to find the guidance of God in small and unexpected ways, such as a stranger calling out fishing instructions from the shore. Just another reminder that because they were in motion, because they were actively waiting, there was an opportunity that was presented to them, okay? An instruction, a direction. So insight 3, it wasn't the physical difference of the boat that led to the success, obviously, but the spiritual difference of doing something on their own versus doing something at the direction of God. It wasn't a reprimand. You didn't catch anything because you did this without asking me. It was I'm going to involve myself in what you have been moving and doing. So I'm going to reveal myself to you. And it's really a lesson about you can do it on your own or you can do it with me. And here's the difference, results. So all the confidence and skills in the world will only cause us to labor in vain if we are not obedient to the directions of Jesus when they are spoken to us or revealed to us. And it was their diligence and obedience to try again that led to a sensational and supernatural catch, right? So here they are, from nothing, caught all night, to more than enough in an instant, from this pointless endeavor to a pivoting encounter. And John is like, wait, deja vu. I'm having deja vu here, right? And it hits him. And he says, verse 7, therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved, which we know John's referring to himself, said to Peter, it's the Lord. Kind of funny that he says it to Peter. This is specifically, he made a point to tell Peter. And John realizes this has to be Jesus because Jesus was repeating a similar event that had taken place early in his ministry with these very same disciples in the very same lake, right? Luke writes about this in chapter 5 if you want to read about it later. But John figures it out. Deja vu, it's Jesus. And he figures it out first, just like the linens in the tomb. And he specifically let Peter know. I figured it out, and it's Jesus at the shore. Now, when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. Again, being the impulsive activist, Peter basically says, you can sit here and talk all you want, John, but I'm going to swim to get to Jesus first. So this outer garment that he puts on is so interesting to me because they would dress down for fishing. And so they'd take their outer coat off. It was a coat. It was basically a wool coat that he puts on to dive into the water. So he's not considering the fact that this coat is going to soak up water as he swims, causing it to drag and strain as he's straining harder to get to the shore. All that mattered to him in that moment was, I need to get to Jesus. So he throws himself in the water after putting on his coat. And I love how one scholar said, John may have been the first in recognition, but Peter would be the first in devotion. Again, he may be impulsive, but he was the first to do something about what he knew. One scholar wrote this. He said, the boat couldn't move quickly enough for Peter, and he didn't want John to be first again. So there is still this competitive nature going on with these guys, right? Perhaps, the scholar says, Peter thought maybe he might walk on water to shore once again. Maybe Jesus would do that again, right? But verse 8, but the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, but about 200 cubits, dragging the net with fish. So while Peter is swimming the length of a football field to shore, the rest of the disciples are doing the hard work of rowing the boat with all the fish in tow. And they get to the shore, and Jesus was waiting as the humble servant that he has always been for them. In verse 9, it says, then as soon as they had come to the land, they saw a fire of coals there, and fish laid on it, and bread. Jesus made them breakfast. Jesus said to them, bring some of your fish which you have caught. Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to the land full of large fish, 153, and although there were so many, the net was not broken. That's a big catch. And a side note, we don't know why John included the number of fish that were caught. Most likely because Peter and John, some of them were fishermen, and it was a common practice to count the fish, right? And being one of the largest and most impressive hauls of their career after catching nothing, that the net didn't break, you're darn right he's going to add that, right? It's like the fisherman story long ago. It was like, caught a fish this big, right? But here's a reality. John's saying, no, we caught this many fish. This is so precise. Anybody who is a fisherman can relate and understand how supernatural that would have had to have been based on that story. So he's saying Jesus displayed his power over nature. But 153 fish plus a wet net, scholars say, would equal close to 300 pounds. And here we just read that Peter decides to use his brute strength to go on his own to drag it. Why? Because Jesus said, bring me some of your fish. So Jesus, once again, Peter is jumping in. I will do it. I gotcha. I'm going to obey. Verse 12, Jesus said to them, come and eat breakfast. Yet none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? Knowing that it was the Lord. And this is a huge switch, right, from the weeks before. By Greek terms, basically what John is saying, there was no longer a need to examine Jesus by questioning him. Their hearts their mind, their souls were so fully persuaded that Jesus was the Son of God, they need not ask anything more. And it's interesting, remember, that John would include this statement since Thomas was one of the disciples sitting in the boat. Thomas had come to a full understanding and surrendering at this point. It just made me thinking through that. What personally, question on your outline, what personally stands in the way of you or me being so utterly convinced in not just the Son of God as our being, but the provision and the power and authority of Jesus? What stands in the way of that you need not ever question him again? A reminder that we're always in process of that, right? But the bottom line is a heart that is confident in who Jesus is and who he says he is and what he says he will do, he will do. Having that utter confidence to the point where we're not shaken. It made me think of Psalms 112, verse 7. It says, he is not afraid of bad news. His heart is firm, trusting in the Lord. That's a powerful verse. That's a powerful place of trust. There's a lot of things we can think could go wrong, and we gear ourselves up for the worst case scenario, right? But to say, I'm not afraid of bad news, my heart is firm, trusting in the Lord, no matter what. And insight for our growth in faith should strive for a heart so surrendered that hope or peace or joy or contentment are not dependent on circumstances, but only on the person of Jesus and who we know him to be. Verse 13, Jesus then came and took the bread and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. This is now the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Okay, so Jesus made a fire which already has some fish cooking on it and invites the disciples to eat with him. Don't miss the significance of this, because the picture of Jesus waiting on the shore with a fire for them to warm themselves and a meal for them to eat and feed on is an intimate portrayal of forgiveness. Because at this time and in this culture, to share a meal with somebody who doubted you, who denied you, and who wronged you by turning their back on you when you needed them, this was a devout expression of love and renewed relationship by making them a meal and asking them to come and eat. And I love how Charles Spurgeon sets this scene. He says, they ate the bread and fish that morning, undoubtedly in silent self-humiliation. Peter looked with tears in his eyes at that fire of coals, remembering how he stood and warmed himself at a very similar fire when he denied his master in front of his enemies. Thomas stood there wondering that he should have dared to ask such proofs of a fact most clear. All of them felt that they could shrink into nothing in his divine presence, since they had behaved so ill. They were aware of their presence and what they had done, yet Jesus still humbly not only invited them to eat, but made the meal for them, invested in giving them warmth. And Jesus is in the business of restoration, and this is where he makes it very personal for Peter. So verse 15, this is very familiar. Anybody who's grown up in church or has been around church, you have most likely heard this. But let's read 15 through 17. So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? Said to him, yes, Lord. Peter said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my lambs. He said to him again a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, then tend my sheep. Verse 17, he said to him a third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was grieved at this point because he had said it to him the third time. Do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. So we're going to deep dive here for a minute. And I want to offer through this conversation some insights into the process of restoration as demonstrated by Jesus in this short conversation. Number one, Jesus recognizes our human weaknesses. So notice that Jesus addresses Peter as Simon, son of Jonah. He doesn't call him Peter. John does in telling of the story, but Jesus refers to him as Simon, son of Jonah. Why? Simply put, it was a gentle acknowledgement to Peter that his failure was due to his human limitations. Right? This is Jesus, by grace, extending to Peter, basically saying, you're human, you're in process. However, the rhetorical line of questioning, as we know Jesus operates under, was to help Peter acknowledge and confess those weaknesses. But do not mistake Jesus for being cruel by calling Peter out in front of his peers, as so many people are like, why would he do that? Right? It wasn't an attempt to embarrass or shame him publicly, because the truth is, number two, Jesus desires to begin with a private conversation. What people don't realize is that according to Luke 24, Jesus appeared to Peter privately on the day of his resurrection. Scholars pretty much all agree that even though we don't know the details of that conversation, it's safe to assume that Jesus offered such an immense amount of grace and love and forgiveness and hope to this humbled and embarrassed and ashamed Peter, that from that private conversation, it gave him the courage that he needed to return and keep showing up. And as a result of this individual private confession, where I'm sure Peter was bowing before his Lord, where he was humbled to the nth degree, from this heart-to-heart conversation, Peter's heart was humbled, but Jesus did not humiliate him. Or else why would he have kept coming back into the presence of Jesus? Which is why private confession is so important. Jesus wants those one-on-ones where we are openly saying, I'm human, this is where I screwed up, which is what he is asking and inviting Peter to do. So therefore, now, after that private confession, Peter was ready to begin the path to restoration in a very public manner, which leads to a public opportunity for validating that forgiveness. And that's number three. Jesus will publicly confirm his forgiveness and restoration of a humbled heart. Now, this can happen through various means, and it's very personal for everybody, but let's specifically speaking for Peter, it was a chance for him to authentically express his love rather than impulsively speak about a love that he had not yet truly understood. Okay, so Jesus asked Peter, do you love me more than these other disciples? Because it was Peter who impulsively and arrogantly told Jesus, I would never deny you. I love you more than any of these other guys for you. I would die for you. I love you more than all of these. Remember he said that in the garden? So Jesus wants Peter to now understand how he overstated his love and devotion before. It was an emotional reaction, not a decision made. And as Charles Spurgeon says, a man's repentance should be equivalent as his sin. And since Peter failed to act upon that expressed love by denying Jesus 3 times publicly, it is very fitting that Jesus would arrange a public setting around a fire filled with his friends, recreating a scenario where now Peter gets to affirm Jesus publicly with an honest exploration and expression of love. But this is where it really gets good. This is where the Greek brings it to another level. So 3 times Jesus asks Peter, do you love me? 3 times Peter answers, yes, I love you. However, there are 2 different Greek words for love being spoken here. One Greek word for love is agapeo, which is an unselfish, unconditional, sacrificial, divine love, 100% of the time with 100% of all I am. The other Greek word being used here is phileo, which is more of a friendly admiration. You know, as the relationship allows, I will love you when I can, right? So allow me to retell you this conversation, revealing the Greek terms as it flows out. So first, Jesus asked Peter, do you agapeo me? In other words, do you love me 100% of the time above everything else, sacrificially and unconditionally? Peter answers, yes, you know I phileo you. I love you 70% of the time with a brotherly admiration. Second time, Jesus asked Peter, do you agapeo me? Do you 100% adore me above all else? Peter answers the second time, yes, you know I phileo you. I still have feelings for you. About 70% of the time. Finally, the third time, Jesus turns the tables. The third time, this time, Jesus asked Peter, do you phileo me? Do you even truly admire me 70% of the time, as you say? And John tells us that third question, Peter was grieved. He was saddened by this third question, not because Jesus kept asking, but because he used Peter's term, phileo, calling him out. Jesus wanted him to search his heart. Do you even love me as much as you think you do? And at this third question, Peter recognizes the significance of this question as a reference to his three denials, right? And he changes his tone with his answer. He surrenders and appeals to Jesus's knowledge of him, saying, Lord, you know all things. You have to understand the demeanor behind this is, Lord, you really do know all things. You know my heart right now. You know that I love you. I phileo you. The best that I can is what Peter realizes. This was a pivotal moment. Because remember, before in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Peter had defended himself, saying, I love you more than these, I will never flake out on you, I would die for you, he was basically telling Jesus, you don't know me at all, I'm going to prove you wrong. And he tried to prove him wrong by trying to defend Jesus, when cutting off the ear, right? But here, he's realizing he loved out of a sinful place, not out of a place of wholeness and purity. At this moment, Peter recognizes and professes publicly that Jesus does know him. He knows his heart. He knows his weaknesses. And he knows things that Peter has not even discovered about himself yet. That's the line of questioning, rhetorical questioning. He's allowing Peter to discover his human nature. Peter wanted to love him, but he wasn't sure really how to do so. I'm loving you the best I can, was what that final response was. Insight number 5, true transformation comes when a complete understanding of our own limitations is met by the restoring power of Jesus. This is a moment in time for Peter that he will never, ever forget. Because despite the process of discovery for Peter through this, Jesus, throughout this entire process, is still commissioning him with an assignment with every response. Number 4, Jesus will continue to utilize a follower whose heart continues to surrender. So Peter hadn't gotten it at the first question, but Jesus still says, feed my lambs. He's still in self-discovery mode at the second, in the process of becoming more aware of himself. But Peter is pointed by Jesus after the second question, tend my sheep. And at the final response, when Peter understands the reality of his new nature, his sinful self, Jesus again commissions him to feed his sheep. Insight number 6, our restoration and fully surrendering of our hearts to Jesus may be a process, but it doesn't discourage Jesus from wanting to involve us in his work. Peter's failure did not discount his future. Jesus is basically saying, Peter, I love you today and believe in you so much today that I am entrusting you with all these others that I love as well, these precious things to me. He's saying, Peter, will you guide and direct and teach and nourish those whom I love? But notice that Jesus never addresses his failure, but rather brings it all down to love, which is what should drive everything, right? Jesus didn't ask Peter, are you sorry? Are you going to promise me you're never going to do this again? What do you have to say for yourself? None of that. It was just another deeper call to love every single time. Jesus only challenged Peter to love. Because Jesus knows that it's out of love that Peter will be empowered to do what Jesus is asking him to do. And if you know the history of Peter, which we're going to go through some through the book of Acts, it was an amazing ministry that he embarks on after this. So a very powerful, restoring conversation. Again, humbling, but not humiliating. I'm going to summarize verses 18 through 22. But Jesus closes this conversation with Peter by assuring Peter that although he had once so impulsively declared to die for Jesus and failed, his time to follow through on that commitment would actually come in his future by way of crucifixion. Jesus tells him, you're going to be crucified. And that may not sound assuring to us or for Peter at the moment, but remember, Peter was just truly coming to grips with his sinful nature and the question of whether he could even live for Jesus. But Jesus is not saying, not only will you live for me, but you actually will get to love me to the degree that you will die for me. So not only will you accomplish what I've asked you to do, but you will fulfill your promise to love me above all else. Even though you can't do it or see it right now, you will love me to the point you will die for my name's sake. But don't worry, Jesus says, it's not going to happen until you're an old man. Not sure that was comforting at the moment, but it would be throughout Peter's ministry as he faced death frequently. And at the end of this prediction, Jesus once again, this is what I love so beautifully. He says, you're going to die. You have a new discovery of me. All of these things are happening. And at the end of all of this, Jesus says, once again, invites Peter, follow me. A do-over. Now that you know more than you ever knew, now that you truly know who I am extending that same invitation that I made to you before you failed. Every single day, Jesus is saying that same thing to us, inviting us to follow him despite what our thoughts were, despite our fears, despite our doubts, despite our sinful nature. He still says every single day, follow me today. Follow me into this next hour. At this point, Jesus must have taken Peter by the shoulder and walked away, and having a more of a private conversation, because verse 20 tells us that Peter turns around and he sees John following them. Peter, now knowing his future, asks Jesus, turns around, sees John following him, and he asks Jesus, well, what about this man? Peter is still Peter. His first response to his newest assignment was to inquire about someone else. Probably a deflection, honestly, being human, trying to process all that just happened in this short little conversation, trying to process what Jesus had just predicted. But it was definitely, scholars say, a comparative tactic. Is John going to have it is John going to die too? Like, is he going to get crucified? Is he going to go old or young? Am I the only one? Make me feel better about this. Let me compare to what you're going to do to somebody else and in their life so I can feel better about this. But one scholar said it best. Peter represents most all of us. We find it easy to deflect any personal challenge from Jesus by wondering and even worrying about what other disciples are doing or what Jesus may require of them. Jesus basically responds to Peter saying, if I want him to live until I come back, what is that to you? What concern is his life to you? You do as I have commanded. You worry about you. The Bible clearly warns us about comparison. Galatians warns us to not compare our own accomplishments to those of others. 2 Corinthians warns against the pride and false humility that comes when we measure ourselves against others. Like, we become jealous if God appears to do something better for someone else, or we become prideful that we seem to be more in God's favor because what he's doing in our life, but not somebody else's, right? Nobody wins in that scenario. Insight 7, in this little conversation right here, Jesus is saying, a heart truly surrendered to me need not be validated or invalidated by my work in another person's life. Trust the story I am writing in your life as perfect for you. Hard to do, says the person who's a 4 and wants to be jealous of everybody. That one hit really home for me. Interestingly enough, approximately 34 years after this conversation between Peter and Jesus, Peter does die by crucifixion at the hands of the Roman Emperor Nero. Yet John, by the most reliable accounts, seems to be the only disciple to die a peaceful death rather than a martyr. Not that he didn't suffer in his ministry, but death as a martyr. Historians say that as Peter was about to be crucified, he considered it such a glorious, phenomenal thing to die for Christ in such a way, but he begged to be crucified upside down, not considering himself worthy to die in the same posture or manner as Jesus. He went a long way from 70% to 100% in his lifetime. And I love the fact that it is only John, one of Peter's biggest competitors within the Gospels, who writes of this restorative account of Peter. Above and beyond the rivalry between these two, John wanted us to know what Peter personally got from Jesus. And he was probably so proud of that process for Peter that he had to share it and write it. Of course, it's the Holy Spirit. We know that. But there's reasons the Holy Spirit includes these things. Because without this story, we would jump from a Peter who passionately denied Jesus to one who became a prominent leader in the early church. But there was a process of restoration in between that is clearly laid out in this passage. Yet the Holy Spirit empowered John to include such a valuable lesson for all of us who have a sinful nature, which is all of us. The fact that growth in our faith and our love and commitment to Jesus is a process. We will always continually say that. But when fully surrendered to what Jesus will do in the process is where we discover our unique and personal story of what Jesus wants to personally say to each of us. Jesus longs to have those restoring moments in your life so that he can bring you to the fullest fruition of the story that he's writing in you. What would stand in the way of you allowing God to say, I see you, I know you, do you love me? Say yes, then follow me and do what I direct you to do, and you're going to have the best version of your story that you could never write on your own.